Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Both were determined to win the election, but neither of them has emerged as a clear winner. The U.S. could be in for days, even weeks of uncertainty. The record number of ballots sent by mail will now become the focus of a bitter fight. Absentee ballots made it easier for Americans to vote amid the COVID-19 pandemic. But absentee ballots are also more likely to be delayed, slowed down by mistakes, or even rejected, something that is now dictating events across the U.S.
We will first see fights over whether certain absentee ballots should be counted or not be counted with the election administrators in those states. It won't be surprising if whichever side loses those battles runs to court to try to get a court to overturn it.
With Election Day over, the clock is ticking. There are a couple of dates to keep in mind. December 8th is Safe Harbor Day. That is the deadline for states to declare a result if they want to guarantee that their decision will count towards the national outcome. The next deadline, on December 14th, the Electoral College has to vote. That is the body that actually elects the president. The states select either Republican or Democratic electors depending on the results. If there is still a dispute at that point, it could get really complicated. Both sides might claim victory. That means states could end up with opposing groups of electors, one for Biden, another for Trump. Congress would be forced to decide between them.
But if we get to that point, we're already in a dark and dangerous place. And if the process drags out over some significant period of time, even though the media is preaching patience to the public, I think in our social media toxic political culture, that could become a more explosive situation fairly quickly.
Some Americans worry that a more explosive situation could look like this: the president's supporters and opponents fighting on the streets if there is no clear result for several days or even weeks. Law enforcement and even the military could be called in to bring things under control. And what about another scenario that Democrats fear and that President Trump himself has refused to rule out? That the ballots show the president losing, but he refuses to accept the result and tries to hang on to the presidency.
The governor did a good job. I don't know if you appreciate it.
Well, the current president's term ends on January 20th by virtue of the Constitution, period. I would assume that any officials who might need to be involved in making sure that transition happens will follow the commands of the newly elected President Biden, because he would be the president.
The legal fight started months ago. The Democrats and the Republicans have amassed an army of lawyers who have already been clashing in court over how and when ballots should be counted. Now they will push that legal battle as far as it takes to decide the outcome of the election.
And back now with Richard Walker and Phil Ayub joining us here in the studio for some analysis on that. Phil, what could we be looking at now, you think, within the next weeks? I mean, I assume the lawyers are already on the ground. They are in place. It seems as if we're setting up for a real battle here.
Yeah, I mean, this is really unprecedented. I don't think there's a really clear answer to that yet. It also depends a lot on how members of the president's own party respond to the kind of statements he's made lately. I think, from my perspective, as a political scientist, the votes need to be counted. That's just a normal process of how it works, that you have time after the election. There's no rule that says it has to be counted that night in these states. And this is, and this could, how that plays out depends on that. I think what's really troubling to me also is the rhetoric coming from the president, which is really, in terms of democracy, is really troubling, and also in terms of what that could mean in terms of unrest in the country with different parties' bases.
Let's talk more about that, Richard. The potential for unrest in the United States, because, there are these images coming in from, major capitals with shops boarded up, big landmarks such as, the Empire State Building, Macy's in New York, with its windows boarded. That's really shocking, I think, for somebody to see who knows America and who knows the country. How tense is the situation right now?
Well, I think it's very understandable that they've done that. that. Even, I mean, the White House itself is also completely barricaded. They started with a fence and they then brought in these enormous concrete barricades. You can't get anywhere near the White House. But that's no surprise, really. I mean, this year we have seen violence on the streets already. We have seen people killed in the streets already in the United States. So I think it's not at all beyond the scope of our imagination to think that, you know, this situation could turn to unrest. I mean, you imagine what we're potentially setting up here is in one or multiple states, legal challenges taking place. That's bound to spark protests from supporters of either side who are on the streets outside, courthouses. So you have all sorts of potential flashpoints for how this could flare up. So that means that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are both in positions of huge responsibility to guide the nation through this phase of political uncertainty in a responsible manner and not to inflame violence.
And I wonder, Phil, if you can perhaps, compare and contrast what we're seeing right now, for example, with what we saw back in 2000 in Bush v. Gore, for example. I mean, that went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Talk with us about, Gore's reaction as the one who lost that case, for example, and, how high are your hopes that right now in the United States that the democratic process itself will indeed prevail in the end?
Well, I mean, my hopes are high that the institutions can prevail, but that depends, right now. I mean, the difference in 2000 is quite clear. You didn't have either candidate tweeting, their opinions about how the process should go, and you had a candidate, Al Gore, that accepted the decision by the Supreme Court and backed down and allowed for a peaceful transfer of power. That is different, and as Richard pointed out, with unrest, it's not just that we can expect unrest. We have had unrest for the last months, for the last years, but especially for the last months. If you think of the Democratic governor, Whitmer of Michigan, where militia were planning to kidnap her and were egged on by the president in a way in tweets that came after that. So these are, this idea of unrest ensuing now is very, very different than the expectation of that in 2000, which was not there.
Richard, what do you think the world is making of all of this right now? I mean, they're looking on at America right now, a time of deep uncertainty, a time of deep polarization. I mean, how are people looking on this situation? How are international leaders potentially positioning themselves?
Yeah, well, we've started to hear some comments. Obviously, many leaders are being very cautious about what they say. They don't want to be seen as interfering in the US political process. But I think here in Europe, you're going to see, certainly just sort of dismay, effectively, that the political system in the United States, which is, for all of the difficulties in the transatlantic relationship, the United States is still the world's oldest democracy. It's still a model of the values that Western Europe also stands for. And there's dismay that they're seeing that this is potentially being chipped away or potentially slipping into a serious crisis, and also worry about, could that be the future in Europe too? It's always seen as, a trailblazer in the United States. But also in the rest of in the non-democratic world, if you, think of China. China presents its model of authoritarian kind of state-directed capitalism as the superior model. And China can very easily point at what's going on in the United States and say, well, aren't we right? Is that what you want? Is that really the better way?
And indeed, I mean, certainly the Democratic ticket has been framing this as the battle for the soul of a nation. They have said that Donald Trump's politic is not representative of the broader American public. And Phil, I'd just like to get your reaction to that, and ask you, the fact that this race is so close at this point. The Democrats were hoping for a statement election. They're not getting that. Yeah. That is very clear. It seems as if they were really setting themselves up now for a battle which might go to the courts. What does that say about America right now and the level of divisiveness?
You know, I mean, this is where Joe Biden is wrong. He ran a campaign where he said that the character is on the ballot, that this is not who we are, that these last 4 years were a mistake, an aberration in a way. And I think that's wrong now. No matter what happens tonight, this is who we are. I mean, there is the fact that we have massive turnout and we have, you know, half of the country really fired up by a president that has entertained theories from QAnon, that has, has told Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. I think that this is a problem, that we have to, that's going to stay with us for a while.
Phil Ayub, Richard Walker, thank you so much to both of you. Well, the U.S. presidential election remains too close to call, as we've been highlighting, with vote counting continuing in key states that will decide who wins the White House. So far, neither President Donald Trump nor his Democratic challenger Joe Biden have clinched the 270 electoral college votes needed to win. The southwestern state of Arizona is the latest battleground state that has been called. It is 11 votes that are going to go to Joe Biden, making it the only state to have flipped party since the 2016 election. But votes, they are still being counted in the decisive Midwestern industrial states, including Michigan, with its 16 electoral votes, which Trump won the last time around. And as we can see, 80% of the vote now there counted, Donald Trump in the lead. And in Wisconsin, with 10 electoral votes at stake, we can see right now who is pulling ahead in that state. And it is indeed Joe Biden, but just by a very, very, very slim margin there, with 95% of the vote counted. The biggest prize still remaining, and this is the state that you have been hearing about all week, Pennsylvania, 20 electoral college votes. This is Joe Biden's home state. This is where he was born, in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Trump won it handily in 2016, and now with 64% of the vote being counted in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump pulling ahead with 55% of the vote, but in Pennsylvania, still early days there. So right now, the race to win the Electoral College is open, with Democrat Joe Biden at 238 votes, President Donald Trump at 213. As you heard, Donald Trump declared war on mail-in voting, which he claims without evidence has led to a massive fraud. We've seen the number of absentee ballots break records this year, in part because of the coronavirus pandemic. But how secure is vote by mail? DW's Sumi Somaskanda reports.
It's been one of the president's chief concerns and a favorite target, mail-in voting.
Universal mail-in is a very dangerous thing. It's fraught with fraud and every other thing that can happen.
In person and on Twitter, the president spent months sowing confusion and doubt over the integrity of the election.
They're trying it again with this whole 80 million mail-in ballots that they're working on, sending them out to people that didn't ask for them.
So what is actually happening? Well, the pandemic has changed the way Americans have voted this year. A record number of people have voted by mail. But President Trump's claims of rampant voter fraud, that huge numbers of people who don't have the right to vote are trying to cast ballots, or that others are trying to vote twice, well, there's no history of that happening.
And just to be clear, voters can trust mail voting. We've been doing it a very, very long time in the United States, and there are lots of checks about it. And voter fraud is extremely rare in the United States.
The rules for mail-in voting depend on where you live in the U.S. This year, 9 states and Washington, D.C. sent ballots to voters automatically. This is what the president has railed against. In more than 30 states, voters could apply for a ballot to send in by mail. In these 5 states, in order to vote by mail, you had to give a reason why you couldn't vote in person, and the pandemic alone was not reason enough. Mail-in voting can be complicated for anyone doing it for the first time. Some forget to sign the ballot, others don't seal it exactly right. This year, around 30 states have allowed voters to cure their ballots. They contacted voters letting them know there was a mistake and allowed them to correct it.
As America gets more and more used to mail-in voting, this process becomes something that's more widespread and that people know about. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to safely vote, even in the context of the pandemic.
And while there's been controversy surrounding mail-in voting this year, election expert David Becker has an important reminder.
I think American elections work remarkably well given some of the challenges we face. Anytime 150 million Americans do something at the same time, there are going to be errors, there are going to be problems. That doesn't mean they're systemic problems.
With Election Day over, all that's left is for officials to make sure all those mail-in ballots count.